Now we're going to change gears. Thus far, we have talked about long run. Everything's been about the long run. If we take GDP and plot it over time, it looks something like that. Over time, we've got GDP gradually increasing. That's economic growth. But in reality, GDP doesn't flow along like that. That's kind of what we've been doing so far. We've just been talking about how things fit together. We're talking about the banking system, we're talking about the financial system, we're talking about unemployment and inflation and all that over the long run. But in reality, we've got these fluctuations. Those economic cycles, often called the business cycle, where we've got expansions, we've got a peak, we've got a recession. We've talked about this before when we started in with productivity. And here we've got the trough, another expansion, another peak, another recession or contraction. And we just kind of have these fluctuations around the long-run trend. And as mentioned before, quick review, this is called potential GDP or long-run sustainable GDP. And these are that's the business cycle. Now in the long haul, 3% growth of real GDP is about normal. That's what's sustainable. Sometimes it gets higher than that. When it's lower than that, when it gets higher than that, we worry about inflation. When it's lower than that, well, we don't like that, especially when it's negative. That's a recession. But now we're going to start looking at these fluctuations. Now, these fluctuations are, economists tend to focus more on the long run. That's the most important thing. Politicians definitely focus more on the short run. They focus on these fluctuations. Oh, yes. Why would they do that? Well, one of the most basic principles of economics is that people are self-interested. They respond to incentives. Okay? Doesn't mean they're selfish. It means they're self-interested. We've talked about that difference before. They act in their own best interest. And what's their own best interest to a politician? Well, to be reelected. So, you've got elections every 4 years. If you're a president, of course, you only have 2 terms available to you. If you're a senator, you've got one every 6 years, and in Congress, House of Representatives every 2 years. So, yeah. These business cycles are very politically charged. What have you done for me lately, world? So, before we can analyze those fluctuations, we're going to develop a new model. Aggregate demand. Well, we're going to talk about aggregate demand here, but there's also aggregate supply, which we'll get to in a minute. But we're going to start off with aggregate demand. So we've got aggregate simply means sum up together. So aggregate demand, when we look at the components of GDP, the components of GDP are consumer spending. That represents consumer demand. Business spending, right? Investment, capital investment, government spending, and exports. We're going to put X minus M. We've been exports minus imports, or net exports. And all that equals GDP. But we're looking at things from the demand side of the economy, so it also equals aggregate demand. I'll just put an AD there for aggregate demand, meaning GDP is composed of C plus I plus G plus net exports. This represents spending in those areas, which represents the demand for goods and services from these purchasers. So, when we talk about aggregate demand, we are summing all these up. We're just putting it all together. We're talking about the whole pie, not just consumer part of the pie, not just investor part of the pie, government part of the pie, the export part of the pie, the whole thing. So when we aggregate, things get a little fuzzy around the edges, and it's not as precise. Macroeconomics is not as precise as microeconomics. But that happens, that's just the way it is when you aggregate. Aggregate, boy, tough word there. Okay, so, well, the good news is that the aggregate demand curve looks just like the single good demand curve. How lucky is that? On this axis, we put the price level. It's not an individual price, it's a price level, say, using an index. Okay, before I was so rudely interrupted, what was I talking about? The price level on this axis here, and we're talking about a price index, overall prices, not like, for an individual good. And then on this axis, we have GDP, or output, or quantity, okay? So it looks the same, but it slopes down, and it slopes down like the individual good demand curve, but for different reasons. And that's what we're going to talk about now, why this thing slopes down. Now, with an individual demand curve, let's say here's price and quantity, Twinkies, okay? When the price of Twinkies goes up, well, let's say there's the price, there's the quantity. If the price of Twinkies goes up, we're talking about relative prices. We're talking about prices relative to other goods or prices relative to Cheetos. Let's say Twinkies goes up in price. Let's say Twinkies goes up in price from, I don't know, let's say $1 up to $2. And then Cheetos, let's say those are the only two junk food items that available. Cheetos goes up from $1 to $1.50. So they both went up, but Twinkies went up by more. So we say Twinkies went up by relative to other goods. So that's why it slopes down. We're talking prices relative to other goods. With the aggregate demand curve, there are no relative price changes because we're talking about the overall price level. We're not talking about one good relative to another. So, why does it slope down? Here we go. The first reason is the wealth effect. The wealth effect says when prices fall, real wealth, okay, your ability to buy goods and services, goes up, and because of that, consumer spending goes up. For example, let's suppose that the price of a burger is $5, and the money supply per person, let's say, is $5. So money supply over price, That is our real money supply. The price of a burger is $5. And the money in your pocket, everybody has $5 in their pocket. We'll just make it real simple, money per person. So money divided by price equals 1. There's your real wealth. In other words, you are able to buy one Big Mac or burger, whatever, Burger King, Whopper. So, what happens if the price falls? Let's say it falls to $2.50. What happens now? What's your real wealth now? Well, now it's 2. You're able to buy 2 Big Macs if the price level falls. So your real wealth, price level falls, your real wealth increases, and because you're richer now in terms of your ability to buy goods and services, consumer spending goes up. You're now able to buy 2 Big Macs. So you're going to go out and buy more Big Macs than you did before. That's what the wealth effect says. So putting that into our aggregate demand curve, whoops, there's a price level, here's GDP, there's our aggregate demand curve. What just happened? Here's our 1 burger, and that's when the prices were $5. Then they dropped to $2.50, and we buy more burgers. Okay, that is a very simplifying assumption that burgers are the only good, and the money supply stays constant, and the only thing that changes is price. And there you go. So via the wealth effect, we can see that a downward sloping aggregate demand curve is justified based on the wealth effect. Okay. The second reason is the interest rate effect. Well, going back to our previous example, the real money supply, M over P. The price of a burger is $5. Money supply, well, we've each got $5 in our pocket, so our real wealth is 1 burger. And as we said before, if the price goes down to $2.50, our real wealth goes up to 2 burgers. However, not everybody wants 2 burgers, okay? They only want 1 burger, perhaps. So just because their ability to buy 2 burgers is there, doesn't mean they're actually going to do it. So what is going to happen is the price, as the price goes down, savings will rise. Okay, that's savings. They're going to still buy 1 burger because that's all they want. And they're going to save the other $2.50. So savings go up, and because there's more money available in the banking system, right? Because savings increases, the price of those savings, the interest rate, will go down. So banks will now lend out because the supply of savings has increased, so the price of those savings has fallen. Interest rates is the price. They can lend out money at a lower rate because money is lent out at a lower rate now. Capital investment will rise. The lower interest rates make capital investment cheaper, and therefore more projects will be undertaken. That is the interest rate effect. So we've got the same thing. We got exactly the same thing going. We got the price level falling, and we've got GDP rising, but this time via lower interest rates, and this time because capital investment is rising. So again, as you recall, GDP is C plus I plus G plus net exports. The wealth effect talked about how a change in the price level will increase consumption. The interest rate effect talks about how GDP will increase because investment will increase. Okay, so both of those, downward sloping aggregate demand curve works out. And the exchange rate effect. Okay, picking up where we left off with the interest rates, from the interest rate effect, if interest rates are going down, well, let's start at the beginning. Price level falls, savings increases, interest rates fall, and capital investment rises. Okay, focusing in on this part, what's going to happen to the dollar? Well, if interest rates fall, then buyers of bonds will prefer to invest or save their money elsewhere, outside the country, where they can get higher interest rates. So because interest rates have gone down, the savers are not happy, right? Investors are happy. Savers are not happy. So they will do their savings. Whoops, sorry. My goodness. Savings go up. You all caught that, right? These savers are going to buy bonds outside the U.S. because of these lower interest rates. And that will cause, what are they going to do? They're going to have to sell their dollars to buy foreign currency. When you buy foreign currency, okay, to buy a bond outside the U.S., you're going to have to get that currency. If it's a euro, let's say, you're going to buy French bonds, you're going to have to buy euros. So you're going to take your dollars and sell your dollars in exchange and buy euros, but selling the dollar, putting those dollars on the market, will send the price of the dollar down, just like any other commodity. The more you supply to a market, the price falls. So the price of the dollar falls. What will happen to net exports? Well, U.S. produced goods just got cheaper. There are two prices involved whenever someone outside the country wants to buy a good in the U.S. They first have to buy the dollar. And once they have the dollars, then they can buy the goods. So the dollar falling has made our exports, remember this is net exports, is exports minus imports. What we're going to do with a cheaper dollar, foreigners are going to be buying more exports, and because our dollar now is cheaper, we're not going to get as good a deal when we exchange it for foreign currency, so that makes imports more expensive. So we're going to buy fewer foreign imports. So with X rising and M falling, X minus M gets bigger. So net exports increases. So so what we've got so far is through the wealth effect, consumption increases. Through the interest rate effect, this is via a reduction in the price level. Capital investment increases. Okay, government spending is pretty much autonomous. They spend whenever they want and feel like. Okay, they'll raise taxes, or they'll spend taxes, they'll go out and borrow or whatever. So that they do as they please. But net exports, and we'll talk about government spending later, don't worry. Net exports rises. And so what happens? GDP rises. So, going back and summarizing here. Here's the price level, GDP. Okay, if the price level, let's say that was 5 and it drops to 250, we would fully expect to see this increase from here to here via the wealth effect through consumption, capital investment through the interest rate effect, and net exports through the exchange rate effect. So that's why the aggregate demand curve slopes down. Again, doesn't slope down like a single good. It slopes down. Single good demand curve slopes down because of it's a relative price change. No relative price changes here, but via those three effects, exchange rate, wealth, and interest rate, we still can draw it downward sloping. And that's the good news. Even though it slopes down for different reasons, it still slopes down. And it looks like the demand curve that we have become very familiar with. So, now that you know why the aggregate demand curve slopes down, now we're going to look at what shifts it. What will shift it to the left? What will shift it to the right? So, the demand curve, this aggregate demand curve shifts just like the single good demand curve. And the aggregate demand curve will shift as a result of anything that shifts C or I or G or net exports. Anything that will shift these items for reasons, it can't be because of the change in the price level, because the change in the price level is a movement along the curve. But anything that will change these will shift the curve. So let's look at things that will change. Okay, things that will change consumption. Okay, well, a change in taxes. Okay, a change in stock prices will affect consumption. How does that work? Well, we don't need to draw a curve. How will a change in tax rates affect consumption? Let's say tax rates go down. So before your after-tax income was $100. Well, let's say $1,000. Your after-tax income is $1,000. But now, because of a tax cut, you get to keep $1,100. You're going to spend some of that. So C, consumption, will rise if there's a tax cut. So as a result, aggregate demand will shift to the right. So that's not a price level change. Remember, a price level change will be a movement along the curve. but anything else is going to shift the curve. So tax cut will shift the curve to the right. A tax increase, well, you're sitting here at $1,000, and now you only get to keep $900 because your taxes went up. Well, that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So consumption will fall. Okay. That's pretty intuitive. How about stock prices? Stock prices go up. Well, when stock prices rise, you know that affects you. You've got all this wealth sitting out there, and even if you don't liquidate any of those stocks, you're very likely to buy more than you did before. Hey, maybe I will buy that new car. Look at all the money I've got there in my stock portfolio. I think we can handle a new car. Or maybe we'll just go out to eat more often. Look at my portfolio. We're doing good. On the other hand, if the stock market falls, you get a little nervous. You tighten up a bit. You cut your spending. Okay, and the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. Well, what's going to change capital investment? Well, a change in expectations will do it. If it looks like that there's going to be a recession coming up, if they believe business activity is going to is going to change, if they believe that the new politicians who just got elected are going to raise their taxes, okay, just expectations of the future will cause capital investment to change. If the expectations are negative, if they don't feel very optimistic about the way things are going to be, they'll cut back on capital investment. If things look rosy, if it looks like economic expansion is about to begin, their guy won, their guy is going to lower their taxes, their guy is going to increase investment tax credit, whatever, then this change in expectations will cause capital investment to rise. And so it's the same thing. Aggregate demand via change in investment. Rosy expectations will shift it out to the right. Pessimistic expectations shift it to the left. Also, interest rates. If interest rates change for reasons other than the interest rate effect, other than price level changes, that will change capital investment as well, and it'll shift. Okay, it won't be due to a price level change. It won't be due to that interest rate effect, but it will shift the curve. It happens through another way. Say the money supply changes. Okay. All right. And government spending. A change in government spending. Well, like we said, it's more or less autonomous. It just they decide to spend, and they do. So let's just say government decides to build more highways. Okay, more roads, more bridges, whatever, and that will shift the curve to the right. More government projects along those lines. NASA decides to spend more on rockets to Mars. There you go. More defense spending. Let's say things are heating up in the world and we better beef up our defense. More defense spending. All of those will shift the aggregate demand to the right. Certainly that's what happened during World War II. And going the other way, well, if government decides to cut back, they decide for whatever reason. Well, one reason might be that they're so far in debt that it's scary. They might start to cut back on things, and that will shift aggregate demand to the left. And net exports, a change in net exports. Well, an economic boom overseas. Let's say they're booming like crazy. Well, what happens during an economic boom? The people over, let's say in Europe, they're spending like crazy. Everything's good. Some of that spending is going to happen over here. I mean, they're going to be buying goods and services produced there, but they're going to buy some of our stuff too. Okay, so that's going to increase net exports. And net exports being a component of aggregate demand, that's going to shift it to the right. A recession overseas. Well, they're going to stop spending as much over there, and some of the stuff they were buying, they're going to stop buying here too. That can hurt us. It will shift our aggregate demand curve to the left. If the dollar falls, or changes, well, let's just say a change in the dollar. If the dollar becomes cheaper, well, that makes our goods and services cheaper for them to buy. And the aggregate demand curve shifts out to the right. If the dollar becomes more expensive, the dollar rises relative to their currency, that makes our goods and services more expensive. They'll buy less. That aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. Okay, that's a good overview of the aggregate demand curve. Okay, let's review real quick. You know, you're getting, this is rather tedious stuff, I know. Here's the aggregate demand curve. Remember, aggregating C plus I plus G plus NX. The components, the demand components of GDP. Okay, here's GDP on this axis. Here's the price level on this axis. We know why the curve slopes down because of the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the exchange rate effect. Okay, so we know why it slopes down. We know why it shifts, because anytime there's a change in consumption, the curve will shift. A change in investment, the curve will shift. A change in government spending, a change in net exports, the curve will shift. Why? Because all these are components of GDP, okay, which means they're components of aggregate demand. Okay, there's aggregate demand. We've got the first piece of our new macroeconomic model in place. Now we're going to deal with aggregate supply. And the bad news is there are two aggregate supply curves. So first is the long run aggregate supply, but we'll do that. We'll cut this one off and we'll do that in another video.